chukim, the mitzvahs, the reason why the Torah sometimes refers to mitzvahs as chukim is because it's referring to mitzvahs that are decrees, meaning they're irrational. They're not mitzvahs that we understand. So the Torah tells it to us. It could be that, maybe we look and we find other reasons to them, but we don't really understand the mitzvah. And obviously, if the Torah would not have told us to do the mitzvah, we would have never done it. Let me use an example. Eating kosher. Okay, why some animals are pure, some animals aren't. Why, other example, milk and meat, things like that. I mean, you could go, and we do find mefarshim commentators that elaborate on the advantage of eating milk separate from meat and meat separate from milk. But the Torah doesn't give us a reason. It's not logical or rational. That's why it's a chayk, that's a decree. So when mitzvahs, there's a group of mitzvahs that are decrees. Then there's a group of mitzvahs, I'm going to go to the other extreme, which is also the name of this week's parsha, and that's why I'm really saying this today, which are mishpatim. Mishpatim are laws. Laws are basically a code for civil behavior. Understand, every society has a code of how they, a code of law, and how they conduct themselves, and how they treat each other. So mishpatim are almost to say, this is the quote that's usually used, had the Torah have not been written, we still would have had laws like this. Maybe not the same exact laws, but the same idea, the same concept of laws. And then we have the third group, which is the middle group. It's a middle group because we would have never thought to do them on our own. I don't think anybody would have thought that on the 15th day of Nisan every year you should eat matzah. Right? And on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, first day of the year, first day of the 7th month, actually, of Tishrei, we should hear the shofar. No one would have came up with that themselves, and on the 10th day, Yom Kippur, we should fast. But now that the Torah tells us, so it becomes a testimony because we understand that we're sort of commemorating an event. Okay, so you have irrational, completely rational, and those mitzvahs that now that the Torah tells us to do it, we understand why we do them. Yes, Paul. It's for you. Okay? Don't worry about the video.
Don't mean to interrupt, but which prayer were we saying before we studied Torah?
We'll say a prayer right now.
Okay.
Please, for those who haven't yet had a chance today to say the bracha before the study of Torah, we had a sort of a tradition that we were doing, and we took a little bit of a break, so I want to get back to that. And eventually, as I did say, we'll have it printed. So for whoever didn't have a chance yet to say it, here's a good opportunity. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al divrei Torah. Okay, you're welcome. So, no, it's not here yet. That's introduction number one. Introduction number two, so those who were here in previous years might be familiar with this introduction, but I feel like it cannot be overstated because it's always helpful for perspective. What I'm referring to is to the timeline of events. Timeline of events. So we know last week's parsha. Here.
Thank you.
Anyone else coming? We know that in last week's parsha we learned about the Ten Commandments, right? The giving of the Torah. When is that? So we commemorate that every year on Shavuos. And in short, the story goes like this. On the 15th day of Nisan is the day that we celebrate as Pesach, the day that we were taken out of slavery, taken out of Egypt. Starting from the next day, the Jewish people were told that they're going to be receiving the Torah. That was actually the agenda. That was the objective of why they left Egypt. So they started counting the days. This is what our sages tell us. They started counting the days in anticipation for the giving of the Torah. And they counted 49 days, and on the 50th day, the Torah was given. 50 days after Pesach is Shavuos. Shavuos is the day that we celebrate the giving of the Torah.
It's the counting of the Omer.
The counting of the Omer is the 49 days, exactly. So the very day after Shavuos, after the Torah was given, Moses goes up on the mountain. And you might be familiar with this timeline, but I just want to make it because from this week on, for the next few weeks, I would say maybe even for the next few months, it's very helpful to have this, to bear this in mind. Moses goes up the next day for 40 days and 40 nights. He goes up for 40 days and 40 nights for what purpose? I would say for two purposes. Number one, to study the Torah. So God should be able to to teach Moshe the laws. Thank you. And the mitzvahs of the Torah. And the second objective was, it's actually written clearly, that Moshe would go up to receive the two tablets. In other words, to come bring them down to the people. 40 days and 40 nights, right? He goes up 40 days and 40 nights. By the time he comes back, the people have miscalculated, and they sinned with the golden calf, as we're going to learn in Parshat Kisisa, which is in a few weeks. So Moses smashes the tablets that he just received from God, and the next day he goes back up. He goes back up for a second set of 40 days and 40 nights. Okay, he goes up this time for what purpose? To ask and beg for forgiveness for his people, for the Jewish people. In my timeline where I'm holding right now, after two sets of 40 days and 40 nights, I'm holding the day of the very last day of the Hebrew month of Av. Okay, and then Hashem tells Moshe, come up again for 40 days and 40 nights, a third group of 40 days and 40 nights, a total of 120 days, this time to receive the second pair of luchos, the second pair of tablets. The day that Moshe comes down is Yom Kippur. The reason why we know Yom Kippur as a day of atonement, a day of forgiveness, is because that is the history of Yom Kippur. The history of Yom Kippur is a day on which the Jewish people were told and they got to see that they were forgiven for the golden calf. So you understand? Is that timeline clear? So you have 40 days, 40 days, and 40 days. The majority of what we learn in this week's parsha took place during the 40 days when Moshe was on the mountain, when Moses was on the mountain being taught the mitzvahs, the laws by God. And this week's parsha are Mishpatim, those laws. So we go through this week's parsha are really a lot of halachas, a lot of dinim, a lot of laws. Most of them are what we would call ben adam lachavera, interpersonal laws, like interpersonal relationships and as we're going to see in a moment, things that have to do between one person and the next. From man to man, human, exactly, person to person. And there's really a lot, disproportionate to other parshas. There's only one other parsha that has more than this week's parsha. And I would like to go through some of them. So let's start with the beginning. This week's parsha begins, the very first mitzvah in this week's parsha is the mitzvah of a slave. When we say the word slave, we have to recognize that we're actually probably not using the right word. Because although the Hebrew word is eved ivri, a Jewish slave, in other words, we're referring to a case where there's a Jewish slave and a Jewish master, the word slave is very deceiving. Because when we hear slavery, we think of maybe plantations, or we think of other things, of a historic context of slavery. The truth is, the slave that we're talking about in this week's parsha works as follows. I'm going to go through a few points. Number one, how does a person become a slave? Not because of their skin color, not because of they were born into it. What makes a person a slave in this week's parsha?
Somebody that can't repay, like a thief.
Exactly. Someone who stole money, and now let's say they stole, let's say a lot of money, and they go down to his property and they see, he doesn't have as much as he stole. You might be thinking of famous cases, Ponzi scheme cases, where people stole so much more than what they're worth, obviously. And now, what is it going to help to put that guy in prison? Torah doesn't see it, doesn't recognize, we don't really see a punishment. We don't find at all in Torah a punishment of prison. And I want to take actually now a moment as a side note, but an important footnote.
What about Yosef?
Yosef wasn't Jewish law, it was Egyptian law.
Oh.
Jewish law wouldn't put someone in prison. But you know why? I thought you can ask, there is another time in the Torah where we do see an idea similar to prison, but it's not prison. The very idea of prison goes against a lot of what we believe. That a person is created for a purpose, and because Hashem made them for that purpose, and they have to live to the maximum that they're able to live. If by definition you're robbing them of their ability to be productive, which I think is in many ways the definition of prison, then it goes against that belief. But let's go back to the matter at hand. So the individual stole. stole a lot of money. Now we need the money. Because what are we going to do with those 5 people who he stole from, or those 10 people who he stole from? What are they going to benefit by him sitting in prison? So we sell him as a slave, which obviously right away brings in a lot of money. Because if you're able to sell him as a slave, you estimate, his value, find out how much in the streets where they sell slaves, how much would a person like this cost, and now you have money to pay back the people who were stolen from. And even more, now as a slave, he could even produce a little bit, and the things that he makes and the work that he does could go a little bit to pay back his debt or his theft. So that's how a person becomes a slave. That's point number 1.
Sounds more like a worker.
Exactly. I think the English term for it would be indentured servitude, servant. Someone who basically, you imagine this. And you know what? The point that you just made, we're going to see it much stronger in just a moment. Because, okay, this man becomes a slave. So you find someone, you're not allowed to sell him like on a trading block. Slavery that we know of in society from history, people were sold on the street but with chains. We're not talking about here that in this case in the Torah. We're talking about someone being sold by the court, by the Beis Din, discreetly, really, to be able to be a slave to get back the money. Okay, that's point number 1. Point number 2, the Torah right away lets us know that there's a time limit. It's not like you get the guy as a slave and now for the rest of your life or the rest of his life, you're able to work him. There's a time limit. The maximum he would be allowed to be a slave for is 6 years. On the 7th year, he goes free. There are 2 opinions, in fact, if it even means the 6th year since he was sold or 6 years of the agricultural cycle, which would mean that really, if let's say this person gets sold as a slave in the 2nd year or in the 5th year, he only has 1 more year left or a year and a half left. But actually, it seems to the halacha seems to side with the opinion that it goes every slave after their 6 years. The Torah does describe if after 6 years he would still want to remain a slave. Well, can you imagine someone would want to remain a slave? And the answer is yes, because look what we have here. This person has to be treated with respect, with dignity. The master is not allowed to ask this slave to do denigrating work. It's incredible, right? This is not the slave we think of usually. But I do want to be clear, we're talking over here specifically about the laws of a Jewish slave and a Jewish master. So,
even when he's free, you can't free him without giving him some dough.
Exactly. We learned that also in the Torah, that when he goes free, when you let him free, you have to give him a gift.
No matter what he did in 6 years.
Exactly.
Every crime is just.
Exactly. Maybe, you know what? Maybe after the 7th year of rest, they might have to bring him back to the court and maybe sell him again. Maybe. I don't know. If they still need money from him. If it was a real theft that they still need money from him, perhaps. But he definitely gets a year of Shabbos, a year of rest. No one's allowed to tell him what to do, ask him what to do, or anything like that.
I'm trying to follow where this is going.
It's going to point out in this week's parsha, I think, how even in the laws, and right when you say, it says over here, the first point in this week's parsha is the laws of slavery. I want to point out how when some people would typically see the word slavery, they would say, oh, that's embarrassing. The Torah has laws for slaves. It actually is the greatest code of defending human dignity. That's where it's going. And by the way, to make my point, I think even stronger, is that we don't really find in history, almost completely not, maybe one exception or 2 exceptions that we find, that there was ever such a thing as a Jewish slave. Because it was never worth it. It wouldn't be worth it for someone to buy a Jewish slave. The expression that the Gemara uses, hakoina eved la'atzmai kekoina adon la'atzmai. Someone who acquires for themselves a slave, really, they acquired for themselves a master. You know why? I want to make a few more points and then go back to the parsha. If whatever comfortable bed the master has, the slave has to be given equal amount of comfort. Queen size. Okay?
Food too, same kind of food.
What's that? King size. Oh, food also. The same food you eat has to be given to him. And here's where it really gets interesting. The Gemara tells us if there is only one bed in the house that's a good bed, it doesn't go to the master. You hear what I'm saying? This is not called this. This is not the word slave right away from the beginning. Sort of fools us to think that we're talking about a slave. It's not what we're talking. We're almost talking about a situation where imagine a case of a person who's a shlemazel. You know a shlemazel? Shlemazel is basically someone who's not able to get anything right. You know, they're trying this, trying that. It's not working out for them. So he goes over to a friend and he says, you know something, Mayor? Could I work for you? You know, just give me $100 a day. I'll drive you. I'll make you salad. I'll make you food. I'll make your bed. Whatever you want, just give me $100 a day. You see, in a way, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about someone who's like a butler, but with dignity, not someone who's doing low jobs, someone who's doing, you know, work with dignity. So I think that's the way to understand it. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. Okay, good. But the idea is that...
Where did the word slave come from? I mean, that's...
Because you have to understand, we have a Hebrew word called eved. We have an English word which translates to slave.
How do you say in Hebrew, servant?
Eved. Same word.
Same word. So I mean, that's where you...
So that's where the mistake is, you're saying. It's like servitude. It's like...
It comes from the word avod,
to work. Yeah, any one of us who goes to work is an eved. Really, I mean, avod, you know,
A question. This 6 years when he's a slave, can he has a family?
Oh, that you're going. So that actually is one of the first points the Torah mentions. That here's where we get into the things that where he's different than every other human being, or every other Jew. That the master is allowed to get him married. One of the works that he's allowed to do is produce children. Not only that, he's allowed to marry, a maid servant. A non-Jewish maidservant, which is an interesting thing. Basically, a Jew is not allowed to marry a Jew, but this Eved goes down a little bit in terms of status of who he's allowed to marry, and he's allowed to marry a non-Jewish maidservant. This is, according to the Torah, one of the reasons why after 6 years he would say, I still want to be a slave, because this is a lady I could marry. If I go free, I can't be married to her. I don't want this. I want to remain married to her. I mean, because once he goes free, he goes back to being the status of a Jew. But now that he's an Eved, he's a slave, he's allowed to be married to a non-Jewish maidservant.
So what about the kids?
The kids belong to the master.
The kids belong to the master. They wouldn't be his kids.
No, but they're not Jewish.
No, I'll tell you why. The non-Jewish maidservant also has to go through sort of a gear. It's not complete Jewish, you're right. And they probably, when they would get older, they would have to be, accept all the mitzvahs. But there are a certain step of gear, a certain level of gear of being a convert. Not complete, but in a certain degree.
They don't have to marry a not-Jew. They can marry a Jewish person too.
If the master chooses that. It's up to the master is the one who's the shatchen. The master is making the shidduch.
So, but the Jews had non-Jewish slaves.
Okay, so that's the thing. Jewish slaves, it seems like not at all. Or if yes, extremely rare.
Right.
And I mean this we don't find a single reference of a story or an incident or an event in the Mishnah, in the Gemara, of a Jewish slave. No, nowhere. There's one reference that seems to be before the first temple was destroyed. We're talking about, over 2,500 years ago, when it's written, Jeremiah writes that free your slaves. So you see sort of a hint that there was slavery then. But since then, we don't find any Jewish slaves.
So it's teaching us to have dignity for
A fellow human being.
Are we treating the goys that...
So even a guy, so now a good point. Now, there were also non-Jewish slaves. It's not the laws that we're learning this week's parsha. That's why I don't want to get too much into it, because it does come in a different time of the Torah, and different place of the Torah. But I do want to be clear that the few places where we do have reference to non-Jewish slaves by Jewish masters, specifically in the Gemara and the Talmud, we have like Rabbi Gamliel and his family owned a slave by the name of Tavi. We have Rabbi Eliezer had a slave. We find that they had extreme respect for their slaves. I'm not saying this was across the board with every Jew.
Slaves, or are we saying people that helped them and they compensated them?
No, slaves. Slaves to the extent that it was hereditary. When When Rabbi Gamliel passed away, his son got the slave.
Okay.
And when his son, we're talking about slaves.
Okay.
And in fact, I was recently learning a Gemara with someone. The Gemara says that this slave of Rabbi Gamliel was considered so, he was so honored by his master that when he died, when the slave died, they sat Shiva for him, like as if he was family. The Gemara has a debate. How was he allowed to? A non-Jewish man is sitting Shiva, but yes, that's what they did.
Now, when we say slaves, do we have in mind men only, or there was women slaves too?
There were women slaves too. Women slaves too. In the case of a Jewish girl, however, it's even more rare and probably less likely to have ever happened because there's only a very small window where she would be able to be a slave. I don't want to get into it, but that's just a very small pocket. So again, in terms of practice, we don't find really this ever happening, but the Torah at the same time teaches us an incredible amount of human dignity that we have to have for another person.
But doesn't say, when we're talking about slaves, that a father can sell his daughters.
Yeah, so it's only, I said, I don't want to go into it.
Wait, just let me finish. But it doesn't say he could sell his son. It says the daughter. There's no son mentioned, but he could sell his son too if he wanted the money. Which I was wondering what that's all about.
I have to look into that.
Okay.
I don't remember the answer. Okay,
All right.
let's go further. Now, the next laws in the Torah in this week's parsha are the laws of assault and kidnapping. Basically, here's where we're introduced to capital punishment in the Torah. A whole list of laws where the Torah says that for this, mois yumas, the person would be put to death. And obviously, the prime case would be someone who, murders someone else intentionally. Premeditated murder. And then the Torah says, however, if it was clear that the person who murdered was unintentional or inadvertent, it was not premeditated, in that case, we are introduced to this week's parsha, number 2, I just want to read inside, but one who did not stalk him, which means it was not premeditated, he didn't stalk him, he wasn't seeking to kill that person, to murder that person, but God brought it about into his hand. I will make a place for you to which he shall flee. This introduces to us the idea of Arei Miklat, the cities of refuge. There were these cities that we're going to learn about more in later parshias that were designated as cities of refuge, that someone who murdered inadvertently, they would be able to go to that city and find refuge. No one would be allowed to take revenge and kill them there. But if they would be caught outside of the city, if the family would kill them, the murderer, then they would not be liable.
But even if it was premeditated murder, the rabbis made it so you could never convict them.
How do they make it that you never convict them?
First, you got to be two people.
But that's not the rabbi, that's the Torah. The Torah says that that's the way premeditated murder is dealt with.
You got to have 2 witnesses that say you're going to do the wrong thing.
Yeah, it's true. Even to get, and if you're thinking of, I just want to make your point. I don't want to get caught up. I'm looking at the clock, and even in the case of capital punishment where someone did murder someone else, you should know that it's not as simple as I'm saying. And I think that's what Don's point over here is, that for a person to be able to be put to death, they would need 2 witnesses that saw it. But not only 2 witnesses that saw it, 2 witnesses that warned them that they would be put to death if they would do it. It's not true in every avera. It's not necessarily true with murder, but definitely there have to be 2 witnesses that saw it, and the 2 witnesses are cross-examined, and they come out completely, with their story solidified and true, then the person could be put to death. Okay, I have to go quickly through the parsha. The next halachas, the next laws in the parsha are the laws of the 4 guardians. The Torah teaches us about 4 different watchmen. You see, if I give you my car, there could be 4 different ways that I would give you my car. I could give you my car, I'm going up to New York, and I need you to watch my car, right? Or whatever, your car in Century Village, whatever it is. So there are 4 different, either I tell you, Don, watch my car and I'll pay you.
Right.
Or watch my car as a favor. Okay, so there's different halachas, because if I come back and I see that the tire is out, or the windows are smashed, or the mirror was broken off. So if I was paying for it or not, for the watching, makes a difference. And then there's another 2, which is a soicher and a shayel, a renter and a borrower. Because you could be renting my car from me, and you could be borrowing my car from me. Obviously, the first 2 are watchmen that are not supposed to drive the car. The second 2, the renter and the borrower, are. Each one of these 4 have a different set of halachas. in many ways, the renter and the one who's watching for payment are the same. Okay. Later on in the parsha then, after speaking about a lot of interpersonal relationship mitzvahs and mitzvahs bein adam lachavera, between fellow human being, we then go into mitzvahs that have to do with, between us and Hashem. For example, the mitzvah of treif, which is an animal that isn't kosher. Nowadays we use the word kosher. The word kosher really means, obviously the word kosher is actually stretched to mean a lot of things. Like, I don't know if I always remember this expression being used, that it's not a kosher parking spot. You ever heard that? Like,
It's not a kosher deal.
It's not a kosher deal, that's right. So kosher became, sort of used in many more contexts than it's not really originally intended for. Kosher means like it's designated or prepared, ready to be eaten. That's the way we use the word kosher. But we put a lot of things under the umbrella of kosher. You see, there could be an animal that bacon isn't kosher. What does that mean? That it's not from a kosher animal. Really, the words the Torah uses is, it's not from a pure animal. It's not from an animal that has the signs of a kosher animal. But then there's the idea of what's called treif. Treif, have you heard that word?
Yeah.
Treif means like this. Treif literally means torn. Torn. And what this saying is like this: if it's an animal, let me just read the words. It's number 6 on the top of page 2. And you shall be holy people to me, and flesh torn in the field you shall not eat. You shall throw it to the dogs. What does it mean, flesh that is torn? So I'll tell you practically what it means. It means that if an animal, blemish, but I'll tell you what kind of blemish. If a sheichet, a ritual slaughterer, slaughters the animal, even if they slaughter it properly and it's a cow, it's a bull, whatever, it's kosher, they then open up the whole intestines and body of the animal, and they go through it to see if there's anything in this animal that could be made it sick, like a disease or even a puncture, a hole, that would make it sick, that it would fall under this category of treifa, that it was sort of going to die. And therefore you're not allowed to eat it. So it's considered a torn meat, even if it was a walking cow, very good cow. Nevertheless, it's not edible. You should know, in case you're wondering, a lot of animals are like that. A lot of animals, after being slaughtered even properly, they open up and they find that there's a problem with it, and they don't use it.
Are you allowed to benefit from that?
One of the reasons why it was always so important for a sheichet, a ritual slaughterer, to be a God-fearing person, right? Back in the day, it was always like the rabbi and the sheichet. In every city, there was a rabbi and a sheichet. It was almost like the rabbi knew he could be God-fearing or not. I don't mean that literally, but they weren't as careful when it came to the sheichet. The sheichet had to be the most God-fearing person. Why? Because imagine a guy spends a lot of money to buy a cow, works very hard, maybe feeds it and then slaughters it. Goes through the whole thing and then finds out that it wasn't okay. Okay, now he has to face the fact that he just lost a lot of money and he's not going to be able to sell this meat.
But he can sell it not to non-Jewish people. Right?
Probably for a lot cheaper. It'd probably be hard to sell it for the price that he would have gotten. So the idea is, if he's not God-fearing, he could easily say, okay, whatever, no one's going to find out. It's regular beef, like every other meat, it's going to taste the same. That's one of the reasons why.
So we speak about kosher. I know the word comes from the Torah. Where comes the glat? The glat kosher.
Glat actually plays into exactly what we're describing now. The word glat means smooth. In Yiddish, glat, this is glat. And it has to do with the fact that the lungs of the animal, after it's open, you see, being extra strict, is that it has to be glat, without any bumps, without any holes, without anything, that would render it treif. So glat is almost like an extra status, an extra level of kosher, which nowadays became universal, really.
It's a stringency, right?
It's a stringency, but nowadays is really every kosher meat is considered glat, pretty much.
But You mean if it's not glatt, it's not kosher?
No, first, I mean, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that most kosher meats that you buy today go through the process of making sure that it should also be not only kosher but also glatt, which, as I said, glatt means a smooth reya, which is part of the animal that has to, you don't want it to be bumpy because then it gets into issues. Was it a treifa or not? Okay, yes, Paul.
What would be the difference between not kosher treif and treifa? Was that the same one?
The same thing. Same thing. Not kosher. Oh, you're saying about 3 words? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, treif and treifa, and then comparing
So
them.
treif and treifa mean treif is treif. Treifa is you speak is like a feminine form of saying this animal is a treifa, like it is a treifa.
A cow.
And non-kosher became the word that we refer to. You know, number one, it's a pig, it's not kosher. And also if it's treifa, it's not kosher. We just as long as it's not kosher, which basically means ready to go onto your Shabbos table and be proper food, then we say it's under the umbrella of not kosher. That's, I think, what we did. We basically took, you see, I'm just going to, I don't want to get, I'm looking at the clock trying to be conscious because I did prepare something, but if you have a piece of meat, a kosher piece of meat on your plate, it went through so much to be able to be prepared for you to eat. Number one, obviously it had to be a kosher animal, a pure animal. I'm getting stuck with the word kosher again. A pure animal. Number two, it had to be make sure that it's not treifa, that the animal inside is all good. Number three, no blemishes. That's not what also no blood. It has to be salted to take out all the blood. I'm trying to think if that would be all the steps. And obviously no milk involved in the process. And all the utensils that were used had to be properly kosher utensils. So that's why I think when you say kosher, you're basically saying it's ready to go. All the things that had to be taken care of were taken care of. Yes,
Sometimes there are products that have no milk in it, but it says OUD because it's been made on a plant that uses milk, but it's been clean and kosher. But they say that if it says OUD, you should not drink it together with milk. What's up with that?
you mean together with meat, right?
Yeah.
What's up with that? I don't know anything really much about how the OU puts their thing on, put their stamp on the products, but if it says D, then I take it that there is milk in it. There is, I've seen the words DE, dairy equipment, that's another thing. But if it says D, I mean...
I once called up the OU and they said that even though they clean it and they kosher it, if somebody's severely allergic, they would write OUD on it because they could still be...
Traces.
Yeah, so I don't know.
Good question. I don't know. It's okay. I mean, I don't know how they stamp. That's my point.
You can eat meat after, like let's say, the almond milk, made from silk, it's OUD. It's not anything milk in there, but they say you shouldn't eat meat with it, but you can eat meat afterwards.
How does that make sense? I don't understand that.
I know, I don't understand that either.
I could give them a call, but I don't know the answer. I never looked into it. I tell you the truth. And this is just, I want to, you know what? Put it aside. I don't want to get, no, I know also because I want to get into it, but the problem is I'm going to get into it and then not be able to get out of it. Okay. Towards the, after many mitzvahs in this week's parsha, I'm actually going almost toward, let's just add also in this week's parsha, we have the Jewish calendar. We speak about Shabbos. We speak about Passover, Shavuos, and Sukkot, the 3 pilgrimage holidays. Shalosh Regalim, the 3 times that would be a mitzvah to go up to the Beis HaMikdash. And towards the end of this week's parsha, we actually go to something out of order. We return back to before the giving of the Torah, which is something that I hope to be able to address at the last segment in this week's class, if I get to it. Why this week's parsha is so out of order that we already learned in last week's parsha about the preparations of the giving of the Torah, the actual giving of the Torah. This week's parsha, we learned about the mitzvahs that were told to Moshe in the first 40 days, and then we go back to describe how the Jews were told to prepare for the giving of the Torah. Okay, now let's move on to the second segment of the class on page 3, called Theft, how to disincentivize stealing. So I wanted to prepare halachas, obviously, like we do every week, practical Jewish law that relates directly to this week's parsha. This week's parsha describes obviously in last week's parsha, one of the Ten Commandments is not to steal. But in this week's parsha, we learned that if someone does steal, they pay double. They have to pay back in double. So I wanted to look for halachas in stealing, but at the same time, not only coming from the perspective of what is stealing and how not to steal, I want to, a very interesting group of halachas I came across today actually, on how the Torah wants us to disincentivize theft. And that has to do with the following thing, that if we know, or even if we suspect, that this item that's being sold was stolen, we're not allowed to buy it. Because if we buy it, we are incentivizing stealing. And that's going to be the topic that I want to get into now. So please join me. I'm on page 3. Let's start from the beginning. It's forbidden to buy from a thief or a robber the article that he stole or robbed. There is no difference in this law whether he's a Jew or a non-Jew. So if a non-Jew comes to us with an item that's been stolen, we're not allowed to buy it. For also the non-Jew is commanded about the prohibition of theft and robbery, even from his Gentile acquaintances. This is from the 7 mitzvot. They are commanded. One of the 7 no-hide laws is the law not to steal. When I say no-hide law, it means laws, universal laws for everybody. Even a non-Jew is forbidden from stealing. In that case, if we will buy from the non-Jew who stole, we're going to be incentivizing stealing. It's a great sin to buy from the thief or the robber. In case you're wondering what's the 2 terms thief or robber, so the 2 Hebrew words are ganav and gazlan, which is basically someone who steals openly. Gazlan is, and a ganav is someone who steals hidden, like goes at night, quietly, exactly. For by this, if we buy it, he supports the wrongdoers in their transgressions. And on this it was said, whoever is partner with a thief hates his soul and causes the thief to steal more and to steal from others. If he doesn't find the buyer, he won't steal. So the halacha says, I know you're going to say, although it's possible for him to take the stolen item to a place where they don't know him, this isn't very likely for him. It's more likely that a person will try to get rid of the thing that they stole as soon as possible, as quick as possible. So it's not like we're supposed to say, listen, if I'm not going to buy it, someone else is going to buy it. That's not supposed to be our cheshbon. That's not supposed to be our calculation. If we know for a fact that the item that's being sold to us is schmutzik, like you say in Yiddish, it's dirty, it came from a not proper way, a not in kosher way, then we're not allowed to buy it. What I did was, you'll notice, I brought also exceptions. Halacha is good in 3 cases today. I want to mention the rule and the exception. What's the exception? When would I be allowed to buy from a ganav, from a thief? If the buyer's intention is for the benefit of the owners, in order to return it to them, then if they give him his money back, it's allowed. This is only if it wasn't possible for the owners themselves to recover the item. So let's say I see someone's tefillin. Let's say someone comes to me in the street. For the purpose of the story, say a non-Jewish person comes to me and says, look what I have. You want to buy this? It's a pair of tefillin. And it says on it, Meir Friedman. It says clearly, it says your name. I say, oh, of course I know Meir Friedman. I could give it to Meir. So what am I going to do? Whatever. Maybe if I don't buy it right now, then you're not going to be able to get it. So I buy it just for the purpose to be able to give it back to you. That's the only exception. Not that I want it from the thief, but that I'm giving it back to the rightful owner.
Isn't that like paying ransom, though? I mean,
you're saying that is incentivizing in a way, right? For the ransom. But in any case,
Yeah, but you're doing a mitzvah.
when it comes to
I mean, how does
but
that
Don is
discourage
asking
the
at this.
thief?
What's that?
That doesn't discourage the thief. He gets his money. He's happy.
So but it almost like comes down. But it's a show, yeah. But it's right. It's a Shabbos Aveda. You're returning something that was lost from a person or taken from a person. But in this case, I think since the intention, and that's what I think we're following, since the intention is not so you should be able to have another pair of tefillin for $200 instead of paying $1,000, but rather the intention is to be able to give it back to the rightful owner, that I think changes it.
Okay.
That's what it seems from the halacha. Now,
Rabbi,
yes,
I have a very nice story just to tell you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. My grandson lost his tefillin,
I'm listening.
and I'll stand up. And he looked on the bus, and he looked in school, and he could not find it. And it was very precious. And my daughter made a tefillin bag, everything, needlepoint. And the big rabbi said, you know what? Order another set of tefillin. And because he did that, Hashem helped him find the original tefillin.
And what did he do with the new set?
He never got it, he canceled it.
He canceled the order. Okay.
But I had to share with you.
It's a little bit of a miracle story.
Yeah.
You should know. Okay. Let's go on to the next one. The next one is not only buying a stolen object, but even deriving pleasure from something that was stolen. Now, this might be, for example, let's say someone knows that there's someone who stole money, and with that money they built a big shul or big house or something like that. That's a shul is a little bit. No, I don't know, but yeah, it's not the words of halacha, but it's interesting you go there. I don't know, let's just use examples that we have. Even to get the slightest benefit from the item that was stolen or robbed, I'm at the very end of page 3, all the time it's in the possession of the thief or the robber, it is forbidden. If it's in the possession of the robbers, it might be different. Even if the benefit is small, so that also its owner wouldn't be concerned over the loss. For example, changing money of equal value is forbidden with stolen or robbed money. That means if I'm, let's say, exchanging money, someone says, what I'm about to do, let's say, is not in any way going to ruin the original owner. Let's say someone stole $1,000. Comes to me with a whole stack of 20s and says, do you have hundreds to switch with me? And I switch with the hundreds for the 20s. So there's nothing happened now, right? Nothing changed, because if he'll have to pay back, he'll pay back just like he paid back before. It's not like I caused anything to decrease or depreciate in value. Nevertheless, you're not allowed to. Also, to bring into a house that was stolen, an animal for shelter because of the heat, or in the rain because of the rain, or to pass through a field that was stolen is forbidden. So if we know that this person stole this house, we're not allowed to say, oh, it's raining outside, I want to go inside to cover to be protected from the rain. If we know it's a stolen house, we're not allowed to benefit from it. And that brings us to the next halacha. The next halacha is, how about if someone is a well-known thief? So in other words, you don't know if this exact item was stolen, but this man has a reputation of being a thief. Therefore, one who is famous, a famous thief or robber, who has no other occupation except for being a robber, and all his wealth is assumed to be from stealing or robbery, one is forbidden to have any benefit from him. And it's forbidden for a poor person to accept charity from him. Okay. You see, it's forbidden for someone to accept charity from them. You hear that? In fact, a poor person is standing collecting money. If he sees a thief, someone who's a well-known thief, giving him money, he's not allowed to take it.
We talk about politicians.
Okay. Now we're going to go into not a well-known thief, but there are certain items or certain scenarios that leave us suspicious maybe this was stolen. What am I referring to? This is what Allah says. Similarly, if someone wants to sell an item that appears to be stolen, for example, fruit watchmen who sell fruit in a secluded place. Someone who's hired to watch fruit. That's what they do. They're watchmen for someone's field. And then in an alleyway, they're actually selling fruit. You do the math, you put 2 and 2 together, you say, wait a second, this guy's a watchman of fruit. He's selling fruit specifically in an alleyway because he doesn't want anyone to know. Probably he stole it from the place where he watches. That's one example. Or a seller who carries secretly the items for sale. He tells you, you want one? Right? In other words, someone who goes like this and says, you want one, you stick away from that. Don't buy things that someone is hiding what they're selling you, because it might be stolen, or very likely is stolen. Black market. Or who says to a buyer, he says, you could take it, but hide it. As soon as you get it, hide it. So it's forbidden to buy it. And here's where we get to something very interesting. I know I'm going to get into maybe a little bit of hot water here, but this is what halacha says. But don't worry, it's going to go both directions. Even to buy from a woman an item that there is a suspicion that she's selling it without the knowledge of her husband.
Really?
It works the other way around.
Oh, it works the other way around. Or to buy from a man an item of woman's jewelry or clothing where there is suspicion that he's selling it without the knowledge of his wife. So it's forbidden. So if you suspect, that's what I think it would come down to. If there's plausible reason that it's causing you to suspect that maybe he's selling it without her knowing, or she's selling it without him knowing, don't buy it. Not only don't buy it because you might get yourself into problems, but don't buy it because it's an avera, it's a sin in this week's in lois sigzel, in stealing, in basically strengthening the hand of thievery, of theft. Okay, now we come to a very practical thing, at least thing that when I learned it today, I realized how often it happened to me. You ever went to, okay, I tell you, I'm trying to think if maybe you could relate to some of this, some not. You go to a shul. Let's use this example. You go to a shul, especially in up north, so it's very cold, so everybody comes with their coats, and they put their coat in the coat room. They come back after and they see, oh, it's not my coat. That's right. Who has their thing in this? It's not mine. This is somebody else's. But it's the same coat. So you know what? Until I find the owner, I'll wear his and he'll wear mine. Not allowed to do that. You see, also, if the dry cleaners, it's actually going to be spelled out clearly in halacha. If the dry cleaners gives me back something wrong, they give me something in the hangers that really didn't belong to me. So I'm not allowed to say, it's not my business. They gave it to me by mistake, and they gave someone else my shirt, right? So I got someone else's shirt, so because I'm allowed to wear it. No, let's read inside. The bottom of page 4. One whose belongings were exchanged at a banquet or the like you know, the coat room in the weddings, like that. He shouldn't use these, it's dishes, whatever. He shouldn't use these belongings which came to him, but are not his. And when the owner of the items comes, he needs to return it to him, even though his belongings have got lost. So even if the guy says, oh, I don't know where your coat is, you have to give me back mine, he has to give it back. Similarly, one who sends his washing to a public laundry, dry cleaners, and they send him a robe which isn't his, it's forbidden to wear it. Rather, he needs to return it to its owner, even though he lost his. And here we have another exception in this halacha as well. The exception in this case is if it really went by a long time. Obviously, you're not allowed to do that, but let's say it comes years later and you still have that pair of pants or that suit or that coat that you got from the laundry, got from the dry cleaners, then what you could assume is that the dry cleaners paid back the person who this belongs to, and now you're allowed to have it. But only if it went by, the words that he uses is yamim rabim, a long time. Okay, one last thing. To derive pleasure from someone else without permission. For me, this was the most novel of all these laws that we're learning now. And it's an incredible thing, and that we're friends, and I use from you something, but without permission. I say, oh, he wouldn't mind? Let's see what halacha says about that. It's actually, I think, it's very fascinating when we think about it. It's forbidden to benefit from anything of one's acquaintance without his knowledge. We're not allowed to take from somebody else without the person knowing, even though it's obvious to one that when its owner comes to know, he will be happy and will show him because of his love to him in any event, and will show him. I'm not sure if that's, obviously translation is a little bit off here. But if he will be happy because he likes him. Nevertheless, it is forbidden. Lefichach, therefore, one who enters the orchard or the garden of his friend, it's forbidden for him to pick fruit without the knowledge of its owner, even though the orchard's owner and the garden's owner love and esteem him like themselves, and will certainly be happy and be glad when they learn that he benefited from its fruit. However, since at this moment they don't know about this, he would be getting benefit illegally. And I want to read for you the last line of this halacha. One should warn the public who err in this due to lack of knowledge. Many people mistakenly think that if we know each other, then I could use what belongs to you without a problem. No, I mean, before using it, I have to ask you. It's really interesting and the way the halacha spells it out to say, even if we're very good friends, and I would be very happy for you to use my thing. Nevertheless, if I haven't heard that from you clearly, I'm not allowed to use it.
It's like being a mensch.
Yeah, except it's also the law. You're right. It's like being a mensch, but usually when we use the word mensch, it's like it's only nice. In this case, we're saying not only is it nice, but it's actually the code of Jewish law and how we live.
Make sure he heard that.
You heard what I said? Okay. Yes.
But you never can assume that someone wants to to give you something, they may have it planned to give it to someone else.
Oh, that's
Unless
true.
you have the direct objective reality indicating that it's usable or provided to you, you can never assume anything about any kind of situation.
Exactly. Even if last time he was happy that you took, it doesn't mean this time he doesn't have anything else in mind to use it for.
That's right.
Right. There are exceptions that the halacha doesn't quote it here, but other places in halacha, specifically about Judaica articles, Judaica items, to use someone else's talis or to use someone else's tefillin might be an exception. Because in that case,
Without asking?
because you're not using it, you're using the mitzvah of it. That's the idea. And a person, exactly, performing the mitzvah. So a person appreciates when their item is being used for a mitzvah. So it's not like I'm eating your fruit. It's not like I'm using your car, but I'm doing a mitzvah with your object.
I will tell you, my father's had a big talus in shul. So we went to the men's room. So go to hang the talus.
And someone else took it?
And take it and never got back. Never got back. My father was very, very distant.
Oh my gosh.
Just took a talus and that's it.
Wow.
Yep. It's like a thief, a gun.
I mean, I think even the exception that I just said, I'm not referring to a case where it's hanging outside of a bathroom. Because obviously in that case, you could assume that someone's coming to pick it up. But I'm saying, what I just mentioned here, that one of the exceptions would be if I see a folded talus here, I'm allowed to wear it and put it back exactly the same like before. Because if I'm doing it for the mitzvah, not doing it for self-edification, self-benefit, but for the mitzvah, that would be an exception to what we're learning now.
Yeah, but actually that talus was, part of the time of the services,
Not only that, even if the guy was right to take it, he had to have put it back exactly from where he took it. And obviously that didn't happen.
He took my father's, but he left his.
Oh, wow.
Oh, he made a trade.
It actually,
Oh, he made a trade.
This is
it makes the story even sadder in a way.
Yeah.
Because the guy doesn't realize he did something wrong.
No, he did.
Well, he did not.
But
He didn't realize he did something wrong.
how we know? We don't know. I was looking. We were looking all over, and my father was very, very devastated.
It's amazing. It's amazing that you sit here remembering the story so vividly because it was such important. I'm impressed.
You want to hear another story? But the film, just for a second. All of a sudden, we live in Rochester, New York, and they have a big landfill. Comes from Brooklyn. All the garbage comes there. All of a sudden, they see Hasidim. They say, what's going on? What's going on?
Is it a true story?
It's a true story. There was thousands of Hasidim going to the landfill because somebody misplaced
The tefillin.
and they said maybe the tefillin got into the garbage, and they shipped the garbage to Rochester. There was a whole thing was even on the national news. And all of a sudden, Rochester become a Hasidic city, and someone tefillin, and guess what? They never found the tefillin.
They never found
No.
it.
Thousands and thousands of tons
It would not be kosher anyway.
Of garbage.
thousands of garbage from
I actually, it can sound crazy. I just want to conclude with this. I do know a story of someone who had a becher, becher, a kiddush cup. We spoke about this 2 weeks ago. A kiddush cup had a kiddush cup that the Rebbe used, the Wolvovksy Rebbe used. He had it in his house. It ended up in the garbage. He was so distraught. He found out where Rochester probably. He drove all the way there. He got it. You wouldn't believe it. He got it. It was a little bit damaged, because it was stuck together with other ones, but he got it apart and he has it now. It was like a miracle story. Okay.
What about the story?
The story. Every week we say a story, and on page 6 we move on to the third segment. The story. Thank you. I owe you one. And the story is this week's parsha. In addition to learning the mitzvah of how to deal with stealing, we also learn the mitzvah of lending money. The mitzvah of lending money comes from this week's parsha. Im kesef tal v'zami, when you lend money to my people. So I want to share with you the following story. It happened with the first and the third Rebbes of Chabad. The first Rebbe was known as Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the author of the Tanya. The third Rebbe was known as Menachem Mendel, the Tzemach Tzedek. Grandfather, grandson, they were extremely close because the grandson lost his mother at a very young age and was being educated and brought up in the house of his grandfather. after his grandfather passed away, he still continued seeing his grandfather. What does that mean? Obviously, we're talking about tzaddikim, holy people. Many times he would have questions in learning, questions in, of understanding certain things, and his grandfather would come to him and answer these issues and these questions. One time he noticed that it's been a long time since he's seen his grandfather last. Now remember, we're talking about here spiritual. You're not talking about it in a physical form. It's been a long time, and he's been bothered and you might want to say bugged with very, very difficult questions in his learning that he wishes he would be able to ask and approach his grandfather, who had passed away but would come to answer his questions. One day, he's on his way to shul, and that day was a day of the marketplace. In other words, they would only come together once every few months, where they would buy and sell, everyone would sell their goods. And someone comes running over to him, a Jew who he knows, and says, Rabbi, could you please lend me some money for the market today? Because if I know I'm able to get a deal, and then I'm able to buy and sell, so I'll need the money. He's on his way to shul for davening. He says, sure, come to me after davening right away, I'll give it to you. He goes into shul, puts his talus over his shoulder, and we're talking about a holy person who's preparing for davening. He's going, meditating. When all of a sudden it dawned on him, today's the marketplace. If I give him the money later, it's very likely he'll lose a deal. He could probably benefit by having the money now and not have to wait till I finish my davening. He took off his talus, put back on his coat, went outside, went through the marketplace and searched and searched and searched. Obviously, at this point already there was a large crowd there, until he found the man, gave him however much money he needed, went back into shul, put back on his talus, and now, after a long break, he finally saw his grandfather again, this time smiling at him, and told him, you should know, before he answered his questions that he had, he said, you should know that in heaven, it's been decreed as follows, that anyone who goes out of their way selflessly to help another Jew, without any agenda, that's part of the words, without any self-interest, all gates are open for them. You imagine, we're talking here about a Rebbe, someone whose whole life is dedicated and sacrificed his whole life for other people. But what was the issue here? A physical favor for someone else. A difference of a few hours before davening and after davening. That going out of himself and helping someone else, lending the money to someone else, is what he was told opens all gates for him. You should know, as a matter of interest, the story that I just shared is actually a story that the Wolvovksy Rebbe, the Rebbe, said when he first became Rebbe. His first speech, one of the first things he said was this story, to tell us how much we have to go out of ourselves to help somebody else physically. Not only in a spiritual sense, but even in a physical sense. If someone else needs money, we should, without any self-interest, help that fellow Jew. The last segment in the class, where we focus every week on something from Chassidus, a deeper message in the Parsha, I want to put in perspective both something that will put last week's Parsha and this week's Parsha into a sort of a theme. The theme is as follows. The event of the giving of the Torah, which we learned about in last week's Parsha, the 10 Commandments, had a dual purpose. We see this from the very beginning when Moshe turns to Bnei Yisrael, to the Jewish people, and tells them that God wants to give the Torah. He says there are two things that he wants to do. He wants you to listen to his laws. In other words, give us a divine code of commandments by what we should live by what we'd be able to live by and live our lives according to the way he wants. And then number two. What's number two? That we should enter into a covenant with him, a bris. In Hebrew it's called a bris. Bris is a covenant. Brit. If we would be able to divide, last week's Parsha, the primary focus was on the mitzvahs. The 10 commandments, 10 individual mitzvahs, what to do, what not to do. Whereas this week's Parsha, especially at the end of this week's Parsha, where we speak about, once again, the preparation of the giving of the Torah, all the details that are described in this week's Parsha are actually focusing on the second element. What is the second element? Not only where God tells us what to do and we do, but that we change, our quality changes, we become a new identity. What does that mean? I'll give you an example. In last week's Parsha, where it tells us that Moshe comes to the Jewish people and tells them, God wants to know, will you listen to his mitzvahs or not? What do they answer? In last week's Parsha it says, Kol asher ne'emar Hashem na'aseh. whatever God says we will do. This week's parsha, you know what it says? It says whatever God says we will do and we will listen. Naseh v'nishma. What's nishma? Nishma means not only listen, but we will comprehend. The difference between just doing and listening is the difference between am I the same person I was before, but now just doing different things, doing what God wants I should do, not doing what He doesn't want I should do? Or did I change to become, I would say in Hebrew the word would be mahut. Maza mahut. A new essence, a new person, someone who now internalized the mitzvahs, to not only do them, but to understand them, to change, and in the words that we use in davening, not only do we follow Hashem's mitzvahs, but at the time of the giving of the Torah, v'rei mamtanu, God elevated us. We're not the same quality as we were before. And that's very much in this week's parsha. You know, we see this in two ways. Number one, it's a cute thing that a brother of mine pointed out to me. You know, this idea that we learned in this week's parsha, that Naseh v'nishma, that the Jews answered, we will do and we will listen. Which means we're going to do it, but not only are we going to be satisfied by doing it, we're going to also try to understand it and let it change the way we think, our perspective. So it was pointed out to me that that verse where it says that is in verse 24:7. In other words, that it's obviously something that runs through every single day of our lives, 24/7. One last thing is that this week's parsha is the 18th parsha of the Torah. 18 is chai, is life, because the theme of this week's parsha, all the mitzvahs of this week's parsha, is where it's not only that God says and we do, not only that spiritual godliness comes down from above, but that we are elevated to become a greater people by becoming Hashem's people, by going into a covenant with Hashem. So I want to summarize the 4 segments we did today. We did an overview of the parsha. We tried to cover mitzvahs. We did quite a few of the mitzvahs in this week's parsha, starting with slavery, with murder, as well as treifa, food, Shabbos and Yom Tov. That's what we covered in the first segment of the class. Second segment of the class, we spoke about how to disincentivize theft by not buying things that are stolen, not even buying things that we suspect are stolen, not to benefit from things that are stolen, and not to benefit from things that we have no permission to benefit from. The third segment, we shared a story about the importance and the strength of lending money to another Jew, helping another Jew to get on their feet, and how that opens up gates for us, spiritual gates. And the fourth segment, hopefully now we have a deeper understanding between last week's parsha and this week's parsha. Last week's parsha was the event of the giving of the Torah from top to bottom. This week's parsha is where we work from bottom up, where we could now become closer to Hashem. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining tonight. I do have something for everyone who's here.